Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest today is Christoph Guger. He's with gtec Medical Engineering. Christoph, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah, tell me about gtec. What do you guys do there?
So gtec is a medical engineering company, and our headquarters in Austria. So we have two locations in Austria and also one in the US in Albany and one in Barcelona. And this year we also started in Hong Kong. And gtec is designing and producing brain-computer interfaces so that people can control external devices just with thoughts.
So you say brain-computer interfaces. What kind of devices would people control with their thoughts? What's been demonstrated to work?
So we use brain-computer interfaces for communication with locked-in patients. So in this case, these patients are completely paralyzed and they cannot move or talk. And with the brain-computer interface, we're able to select letters and words on the computer screen, and this allows them to communicate. An
example would be like what Stephen Hawking, did he use a system similar or a system that you guys produced?
Exactly, yeah. He would be an example for using a brain-computer interface for communication.
How would that work, by the way? Like, how did the systems that he used, or how would a system like that work?
So in this case, we use a so-called P300 speller, and the system will flash different icons, characters, numbers on the computer screen. And the patient is just supposed to look at the character he wants to spell, and then it helps if he counts as quick as possible how many times this character is flashing. And every time when the brain sees a flash, the brain responds with a P300 response. It's a very small brainwave, and the brain-computer interface is able to detect the brainwave, and then we know at which character the person was looking at, and this allows us to select the character to form complete sentences.
That's amazing. So how quickly can someone put together, words and sentences using a system like that?
It's not very quick. So if you spell character by character, it's about 5 to 6 seconds normally for patients. If you are using the system with healthy people, then they can also achieve something like 800 milliseconds per character. So it's comparable to typing with 2 fingers on a computer keyboard. But of course, you can combine it with a predictive speller, and then you can select words and sentences much quicker.
Well, what's the rate? The approximate rate at which you can select words and characters.
So if you have a trained library for a patient, then they can write a few words per.
Okay. So what other devices do you guys make and sell?
So these brain-computer interfaces are also used for stroke rehabilitation. In this case, we are instructing a stroke patient to imagine, for example, a left-hand movement. The brain-computer interface is able to detect that the person is now imagining the movement, and then it triggers an electrical stimulator, which is fixed, for example, on the left arm, and the stimulator is producing actually the hand movement. This is very important for stroke patients because the hands or limbs are sometimes paralyzed for a couple of years. And when we perform the brain-computer interface training, then the cognitive processes are paired again with the motor behavior, and the brain learns to control the body again. This also works if the patient has like 30 years before a stroke. We can regain motor functions with these computer interfaces again.
Okay. Well, that's good that it's not a permanent thing,
And it goes also very quick for some patients. So some people were paralyzed for a couple of years, and then they come into our rehabilitation center. They train 4 or 5 sessions, 40 minutes each, and then the hand movement starts again. For other patients, it takes much longer. So this is especially if they have spasticity. Then first we have to get rid of the spasticity, and afterwards the motor functions come back again.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting. What other devices have you created that have a lot of uses?
Another very useful system is our Mind Beagle system. So the Beagle is the little dog that you might know from Australia on the airport. These dogs have a very good nose, and in our case, the dog is sniffing in the brain of coma patients to figure out if they have cognitive functions left. Because coma patients are patients with in the unresponsive wakefulness state or minimal consciousness state. They're just lying there and they're not really moving. If you ask them something, then they're not able to give you an answer. But some of these patients have cognitive functions. This means they can understand conversations, but you cannot test it. That's the reason why we developed the Mind Beagle system. It's again a brain-computer interface, and we have different cognitive tests. Like we are instructing the patient to listen to a sequence of tones, so low tones and high tones like di-di-di-da, di-di-di-da. And we instruct the patient to discount only the high tones, and this is producing a brain response again. Then we know that the patient is understanding us. And if we have tested this successfully, we can also go to communication mode. So in this case, we can ask the unresponsive patient something where we know the answer. So is your first name Sarah or something like that?
Yeah.
And with the brain-computer interface, he can say yes or no. And if the patient is able to answer 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 questions correctly, then we have a very objective proof that these patients are understanding us. This is, of course,
you've communicated with people using a brain-computer interface in a coma, and you've gotten at least some people to show you that they are understanding what you're asking them?
Yes, but there are different stages of coma. So pure coma is when patients don't have cognitive functions. So in this case, it wouldn't work. But some patients are a little bit better. So these stages are called unresponsive wakefulness state or minimal consciousness state. We could show that some of these people are able to understand conversations. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. These patients are sometimes for a couple of months or even years in this state. The family or the physicians don't have any feedback if they're understanding anything. Then we are coming with the Mind Beagle, and after a few minutes we can test if these patients can answer yes and no questions successfully. That's of course the visiting schedule of the family, how you treat the patient, how many stories are you telling the patient.
Can you so in these communications, have you been able to tell them, hey man, you're in a coma, wake up? Like, can you tell them to help themselves, or can you ask them what they're experiencing? Like, what have you been able to understand by communicating with them?
At the moment, we are just limited to yes and no answers. We can ask them at least, do you want to see your children or something like that? Do you want that your family is more frequently visiting you? And that's already very useful for these patients and also for the physicians and families. And of course, we don't allow questions like end-of-life decisions with the system.
No, but why don't you say to the person, why don't you tell the person, hey, you're in a coma. Do you realize you're in a coma? Yes or no? Do you want to wake up? Yes or no? You know, I don't know, that kind of stuff. Like,
of course, this is also what we see with our patients. You know, they are in a hospital for many months, and there's no change in the status. And then we come with the Mind Beagle, and they get the mean of communication, and suddenly they improve because they find a way of communicating with the environment. Of course, it's not real communication; it's just yes and no answers. But they also pick up that the family now treats them differently. So all the physicians, the family gets more motivated, the patients get more feedback, they get more involved. And this is also causing these positive outcomes in some of the cases. So we did also a study where we could show if people can use the brain-computer interface successfully, then they get better or they wake up from this responsive or minimal consciousness.
Well, have you seen this has caused some people to wake up? Like, what kind of positive results have you seen? This is amazing.
Yeah, in the best case, they wake up, or at least they start to establish a reliable communication. So we had patients, for example, where all the physicians believe that they're not understanding anything. Then we used MindBeagle in a couple of days, and every day they were successfully saying yes and no. So we could convince the physicians that the patients are understanding something. They changed the treatment schedule, and these patients also improved.
That's pretty amazing. Have you ever been at the bedside and seen this system being used and seen the responses?
Just videos. So I haven't seen these responses personally. So like patients waking up or improving, but our collaboration partners are taking videos to document, of course, the scenarios. That's very impressive.
Yeah, that's really
People
cool.
get also very happy. People get very happy if they figure out that patients are understanding them.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, in addition to yes/no answers, what else do you think you could ask where you can get a response? Could you say more or less or high or low? I mean, it sounds like you could ask a lot of binary choices instead of just yes or no.
At the moment, we were limiting the MindBeagle system to yes and no answers because that's already pretty demanding these patients, and we don't want to overload them. So at the beginning, we thought to give them many choices, like with the logged-in patients who can communicate with the brain-computer interface. But then we reduced it to yes and no because this is the key question that you want to answer with the system. If a patient is able to follow conversations, and then you can objectively test it with the yes and no answers. And this is changing the therapy or the rehabilitation procedure that you're doing with these patients. So the goal is to wake them up or to improve their status.
Well, why would they feel that well if you ask them more than yes, no?
They are fluctuating in awareness. So we can roughly say that about 30% of these patients don't show awareness, so they are not able to communicate at all. 30% are pretty good on almost every day, so you can ask yes and no questions. And about 30% are highly fluctuating, so they drift in and out. And only on specific days you are able to achieve yes and no communication at all.
Oh, so it's not all the time.
It's not all the
periodic.
Yeah, they're pretty ill.
Huh.
It's not so easy to establish the.
Well, what are you finding by asking them the yes/no questions? Like, what surprises you? What do the patients respond to that you didn't think they would respond to, and what doesn't work? I mean, how has it changed the treatment for some of these people?
So important answers are, for example, if they want to see their children, so children should visit more often, or also for families, so that the family knows it's not useless if you tell them stories pending you. So these precisions, you can monitor the fluctuations, and you will see if they show more responses. And this is if they're improving or not. And with MindBeagle system, you see if they improve. Then you know with your treatment or you are on a good way.
Huh. Have you tried to pinch them and say, hey, can you feel that? Yes or no? Or brush their hair or that kind of stuff?
Sure, you can do this. That's also nice because this sensory information is some of the last things that's working in these patients. So they lose, for example, very early vision, don't see a computer screen, but they feel touch. And this is also something that we use in our brain-computer interface. We have actually a little vibrator on the left hand and another vibrator on the right hand. It's like the cell phone, the vibra call in your cell phone.
Right.
And they can say yes if they count, for example, vibrations on the left hand. They can say no if they count vibrations on the right hand. So these are a little trick to get the answers out of them.
How come you can't ask binary questions like hot or cold, left or right, up or down? Why can't you ask other binary questions?
Yeah, you can do this, of course, yeah. We also ask, just for confirmation, questions like, please count the stimuli on the left hand to confirm that this is a yes, and then they have to give us a yes. Same for no. And if we see that they can do it correctly, then you can go to more complex questions.
Huh. What's have you had people that have woken up and do they remember the experience or do they say anything about it?
I'm sure they remember the experience. We had also one extreme case, like 10 years ago, where we used the communication interface, but it didn't work very well. So we tried it for a couple of days. And nowadays, this patient is giving talks about this experience. And he is reporting that the brain-computer interface trials gave him so much confidence that he knew that he should change something, and finally he woke up, and now he is traveling around to report about the situation.
Have you asked people if they realize they're in a coma, or do you think that question would upset them too much?
No, they know that they are in such a state.
They do?
Mm.
Huh. What else have you learned about the brains and the minds of people that are in these states? Do they perceive time? Is there anything else that you've learned?
Not yet. So these questions are pretty complicated. So the mind-beagle system is pretty new, and we are already happy that we could show that many of these patients are able to follow conversations. And we started about 1 year ago to use also the assessment result as prediction tool, so that we can see if they improve or even if they're able to wake up. And we started also a couple of months ago to use the brain-computer interface as a rehabilitation procedure. This is like the stroke rehabilitation system that I explained beforehand. So we use the same technology also for these patients with disorders of consciousness in order to wake them up or to let them improve. And beside these applications, so in many research projects, we use the brain-computer interface also for robotic or avatar control. So in this case, we had virtual reality avatars or real robotic human-like avatars. And in this case, the goal was to give somebody an artificial body that is just doing what your brain is imagining. And we did it with non-invasive sensors. So these are EEG sensors on the surface of the head. But we had also neurosurgeons who implanted the electrodes directly on the cortex. And in this case, we can get very fine motor control. So we can control, for example, an artificial hand, just with the brain-computer interface. And it's amazing how well the hand control works. And we can decode the imaginations from the brain before the patient realizes that he is imagining that. The brain-computer interface speed is overtaking your own speed.
Really? How does that work? Like you'll think about moving your hand, and the hand will start moving before what? You realize it, or how is it outpacing your thinking?
So the brain-computer interface knows that you are now starting to move your hand before you are realizing that you are moving your hand. So we can read it quicker out than you are realizing what you are imagining.
Huh. How much faster is the reaction time?
A few milliseconds. It's
well, I mean, percentage-wise versus normal reaction time, how much faster can you get with using it?
Half of the time is needed to.
Wow, okay, that's amazing.
Recently, we worked also with the face region of the cortex. So that's the cortical region responsible for recognizing faces or symbols, characters. And we had a very interesting experiment where we trained the brain-computer interfaces on certain faces and kanji characters and Japanese characters and objects. The calibration was done within like 15 minutes. And then the person was observing real objects in the environment, like real faces, real people. And then we could decode in real time what the person is seeing without retraining the brain-computer interface again. So whenever the person looked into a face of a new person, we could recognize with the brain-computer interface that the person is seeing a face or an object or a bowl and so on. And in this case, we could also overtake the speed of the person in recognizing which object it is. And it was also nice because we trained on artificial images on a computer screen, and it worked also for real people and real objects in the environment.
Well, people talk about the grandmother neuron, but what are you seeing when people actually recognize the picture of someone? What kind of areas light up, and how many neurons, and how how specific is the reaction from the person's brain when they see a particular person or an object?
So it's called the form face area. It's more or less on the bottom of the brain, and it's very specific. So it's just a few square millimeters, which are coding faces. And it's also a very interesting area for neurosurgeons. A few years ago, they didn't know about this region. When there was a tumor there, then they just resected it, with the consequence that the patient couldn't recognize faces afterwards. Nowadays, we can map these cortical regions very accurately, and therefore the neurosurgeon can spare it and doesn't remove this region anymore.
Wow, very interesting. Well, you're into a lot of amazing technology. Maybe let's talk about maybe one or two more technologies you're working on that you're really excited about.
Yeah, we are also organizing for 2 years now brain-computer interface designer hackathons. So these are events where programmers, artists, designers meet for 2 days, and then they come up with new brain-computer interface applications. So in this case, they are controlling drones, for example, or they're controlling prosthetic or orthotic devices for hand movements or leg movements. They control smart homes. In this case, you can switch on the lights and control the TV set with the brain-computer interface. And in one of these hackathons in Valencia, they designed a very nice augmented reality game. So they were projecting in augmented reality 3 tankers on the floor of a room. And then the brain-computer interface also could control a little robotic bowl. It's called the Sphero robot. So he could steer the robot around in the environment. And the task was to destroy the tankers in the augmented reality game. This was a very nice outcome. Or in a hackathon in Canada, they designed a neurosurgery application. In this case, the neurosurgeon was wearing a head-mounted display, and he could see the patient in the operating room. And the brain-computer interface user was just sitting beside him. There's another doctor helping him in the surgery. And the BCI user could pick mentally, for example, the neurosurgery instrument that's used for the resection. So there are very nice outcomes in these hackathons that people are developing.
Well, if you control something with your brain, with thought versus physically with your hand, does that mean you get better control or finer control, or what's the benefit to doing that?
So first of all, you can use it, of course, for patients who are completely locked in to give them a body back. Another idea is to do, for example, remote journalism. So if you want to send your avatar body to a region which is dangerous, then you can stay at home and your virtual body is doing the job for you. But this is...
No, but I mean, let's say you were a surgeon. You know, you picking up a scalpel versus using a brain-computer interface, or even the Da Vinci robot. You know, you control it maybe with joysticks and stuff like that. How about with your mind? Would you get better performance even than using physical stuff to move with your body? Like, what about those circumstances? Or piloting a plane, you know, sitting in the cockpit?
To give you another limb, because neurosurgeons could also use 5 limbs, you know, to hold all the instruments and do the job. And with the brain-computer interface, you don't need a hand for picking, for example, a surgical instrument. This was the goal in this case. And then you could also monitor the brainwaves to see, for example, if the surgeon is making a mistake, and you can react accordingly to the mistake and correct it. So there are many different ideas which are explored in different research projects at the moment, but these ideas are all for the future.
Well, I guess the scary thing is, have you been able to send the communication the other way? Have you been able to stimulate someone's brain so they see or hear or smell something that isn't there, or they think something that's not true?
This is also a standard procedure which is done in neurosurgery nowadays. So if you want to figure out if the cortical region is responsible, for example, for hand movement, then you stimulate different regions of the brain, and as soon as the person cannot move the dump anymore, then you know you have found the dump area, and then you are careful when you are resecting close to the dump area that you're not touching or destroying it. And we recently did a funny experiment with Dr. Kamada in Asaikawa University in Japan, where we had an epilepsy patient, And the epilepsy patient was looking at the black box and the basketball and also the white sheet of paper. And while he was doing that, we stimulated the face region. And with that stimulation, we could produce the illusion of a face on the black box. We could also produce the illusion of a face on the basketball. This was proving that the brain has certain regions which are responsible for very certain tasks, like a few square millimeters which are responsible for faces. So independently what you're doing, looking at the black box or looking at the basketball, we can produce a face on top of that by just stimulating these square millimeters. If we stimulate another region, then which is color sensitive, then we can produce, for example, a rainbow on the black box or on the basketball. So we can trick the brain with brain stimulation. But brain stimulation can also be very useful. So if somebody doesn't have a hand anymore, then you can design a device which is controlled with the brain-computer interface, but you can also add the touch feeling by stimulating into the sensory motor cortex. So if the prosthetic hand is touching something, then the patient can also feel it because you are feeling it by the cortex. So brain stimulation is also something very useful. And if you stimulate back the sensory information, then the control gets much better and finer.
So it's a way to simulate haptic feedback.
Yes.
Very cool. Well, Christoph, this has been amazing. It's really amazing the stuff you're working on. What's the best way for people to find out more and, maybe contact you or purchase some of these devices? How do they get in touch?
Of course, that's all possible. So we do many workshops every year from Japan, Europe to the US, where people can participate and use the technology. And we do also these brain-computer interface hackathons. The next one is in Hawaii, afterwards one in Austria, and the next one in Japan. So people can pass by for 2 days, work with other team members, use the brain-computer interfaces network, find a master or doctorate thesis, or find a mentor. So these are all very useful ways to get into neurotechnology.
So people can. It'd be funny if people could just reach out with their minds and contact you, but that's not available yet, right?
They can also. We have also a brain-computer interface hooked up to Twitter and Facebook, and then you can post your messages with the brain-computer interface. That's also one of the hackathon projects where teams can register for.
So is there a reasonable or low-cost brain-computer device that you guys sell where people can get it and try it out on their own?
Yeah, this is also what we use in the hackathons. It's called the Unicorn. It was developed with Arno Quibrecht, a fashion designer he's very well known. And people can use this Unicorn during the hackathon, check it out if they like it, and if they like it, they can just get it for their own games or research, whatever they want to do.
Oh, that's really cool. I'll have to check that out. Okay. Well, very good. Well, Christoph, thank you for your time. And the website is gtec.at. gtec.at.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Christoph, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.